Okay, I just started the recording, so you can begin whenever.
Okay. Okay. Hello and welcome back, everyone. So I would quickly request you before we get started if you could possibly mute your microphones and if you can also turn off your videos, which is usually located at the bottom of your screen. The mute is on the bottom left corner and the video is right next to that. So if you were to stop your video and mute your microphone, then we won't have as much feedback. So it'll be easier for us to continue. So if you guys can please do that, and we can get started. Okay, so great. So welcome back, everyone. It's so good to virtually see you all. Today we'll be continuing on in some of our fundamental classes, and today's topic we're going to be discussing AMA, which is a very unique and very important, crucial concept to understand when we talk about nutrition and health and how our bodies work. So this is a really key part in Ayurveda, especially when we look at deviation from a state of health. AMA plays a very, very important fundamental role in us being deviated from a state of health. And so what that does is, usually in any case where we're not feeling well or we're not ourselves, there's almost always an indication that AMA would be there. Or if AMA's not there, AMA was in some way related or responsible in the process of you getting to that point. Okay, so what is AMA? AMA basically means undigested food material, okay? Or basically anything that is undigested is considered as AMA. In the classical text, they define AMA as something that produces or that is formed when the Jataragni or when the Agni is low. So just for you guys to know, it's known, the classical quote is Ushmano alpa balatvena dhatu madhyam apachitam drishtam amashaya gatam rasam amam prachakshate. And that is from Ashtanga Hridayam, Sutrasthana. Okay, so what that means is when the Ushma or the Agni, the Jataragni, remember we talked about the Agni that is located in the stomach, when that Agni becomes low or when that Agni is disturbed, when it is, remember we talked about different presentations or intensities of Agni, when that Agni intensity is not in its sama or normal state, then that can cause a variation in the breakdown or the digestion of food. And when it there is any variation from the normal healthy transformation of food or breakdown of food, that causes the production of this substance called AMA. And this AMA can sit in the stomach, or it can also, depending on how much is formed, can also start to then pass on onto the dhatus, and may also travel throughout all the different tissues and all the different layers in the body. Okay, so it first starts at the stomach. It starts at that level, and then it passes on. So what I want to do is I want to share with you a slide that I have that is sort of a schematic of how this happens, just so you get a little bit of a visual and it's a little bit easier to understand. Okay. So here we go. This is just something that a presentation that I was doing about diet and nutrition. So here we go. Remember in our last session when we talked about the different components of digestion. And we looked at which aspects or which of the subdoshas that are directly related and located in the stomach that helps and aids in digestion. So we looked at the Kledika kapha, which is the kapha that gets released as the person is chewing and swallowing, and it's basically responsible for moisture and for moisturizing the food or the food particles so that it's broken down and it's easier, it's in a better form to be digested. The pachaka pitta, which is basically sort of the digestive enzymes that get released into the stomach, is also a key factor, an important factor that helps in breakdown and digestion of food. And the next part is the samana vata, which is the subdosha or the part of vata that helps in igniting the agni. And the main component here is the jatragni, or the digestive fire. And so all of these components combined together, when working in synergy with each other, really help to produce a proper digestion. However, if any one of these factors are out of balance, or any one of these factors are either increased or decreased, what it does is it changes the ability of this process to then further digest the food. And if the food isn't digested, then it becomes undigested. It falls into the realm of undigested. And that undigested food is nothing but ama. Okay? So that ama is what usually forms first here, and it sits in the stomach, and it's basically like sludge. So have you ever seen, like, if you have you either put oil through a processor, or you have oil with a mixture of water and with a mixture of vinegar, and it sits and you're trying to churn it and you're trying to get rid of it, but it just sits there and it just becomes more and more gunky. That's kind of what ama is. And so this can happen, and this can be produced in the stomach, and it can sit there. So remember, we used the description or the presentation. We were giving you the example of after a Thanksgiving meal. That's exactly what happens when, either due to factors of eating large quantities of food, it's actually too much. So the agni cannot digest that large quantity of food. And what happens is it can't break down. It's not able to break down. So it sits there as this undigested food, and it usually settles right here. It starts to settle. It starts to settle right in the area at the bottom curvature of the stomach, where you see the arrow for the jatragni. That's exactly what where it starts to settle. And it actually becomes sort of like an envelope, or sort of like a wet blanket that sits on top of the jatragni. So when a person has ama, okay, when a person has ama, they're going to start to feel these particular signs and symptoms. What are the signs and symptoms of ama? They start to feel they have a body ache. They start to have a very low appetite or indigestion, of course. It can result in either constipation or diarrhea, and I'll explain that in a minute. They usually also end up having that foul odor or sort of a yucky taste in the back of their mouth. That's one of the typical signs and symptoms of AMA. They'll have that also that foul odor in the sweat, urine, and in stools. They can have a low-grade headache. They can have that fatigue or that lack of energy. And also one of the typical signs and symptoms that we look for is they'll have a coating on their tongue. And it can be white, or it can be yellow, or it can be dark. So these are typically what happens and things that we notice when a person has AMA. Okay? One of the first things we look at is if they have the coating in their tongue. That is one of the easiest ways to find out if you have AMA. So how does this AMA get formed again? This is when there's a process or disturbance in digestion. The AMA is the undigested material. If you can have AMA that is formed in one day, and you can have AMA that is formed over a very long period of time. And depending on how chronic or how many times this AMA has been produced, that determines the intensity of the reaction that you're going to find in the body. So for instance, again, going back to the example of the Thanksgiving meal, if someone has had one meal that is very large and that's very difficult to digest, and the person produces AMA, but they don't necessarily eat another meal like that, and they allow themselves to get hungry again, what happens in that is that the Jataragni naturally increases and helps to digest the AMA. So that can get rid of a one-time production of AMA. However, if the person continues to eat in that same manner, and they continuously keep on exposing themselves to this same type of food, that will help to produce more and more and more amount of AMA. And the more amount of AMA you have, the more it'll start to show up. The intensity of these signs and symptoms start to become more apparent. So for instance, some of the first signs and symptoms you're going to find when a person has immediate AMA or a one-time production of AMA is you'll find that they have this, they'll have the exhaustion and the slight body ache, and definitely bloating when it's associated with vata, definitely indigestion, a bit of heaviness. They tend to feel a bit of heaviness. And they feel that lack of energy or strength. Those are some of the immediate signs and symptoms that a person has AMA. Some of the more chronic signs and symptoms of AMA are the ones like the constipation or diarrhea, and the foul odor in breath, in urine and stools and sweat. That indicates that the AMA has been sitting there for more amount of time. And the reason why it shows that way is because the AMA actually sits in the stomach and it sort of ferments. So exactly the description that is there in your handout, in your book, is the fact that it sits and it ferments. So if you have like this yucky butter or this sludge that is sitting there, and it is also being exposed to these digestive enzymes, which are more sour or acidic in nature, can you just imagine if the sludge sits with that acidic nature, what would the byproduct or the end product of that be? It probably would not be something that is pretty or that has a very good odor. So that's kind of what happens with the AMA that sits there. Now, the more chronic the AMA is, this is what was described in the classical texts. So we know that when you consume food, right? When it's consumed, it then gets, after it's digested in the stomach, the second stage of digestion, or the next part where the food gets passed on to, is it gets passed on to the dhatus, or the tissues. So what it does is, from the stomach, as it's being passed on to the first dhatu, and then being digested with the dhatu agni, which is the Rasa Dhatu Agni. Remember we talked about that there is an Agni for each one of these dhatus. This is where it comes into play. So as the food passes on to the dhatus and gets transformed by that Dhatu Agni to then create newly formed Rasa Dhatu or newly formed plasma, and as well as nourishing the existing plasma, if Ama is there and if Ama is being constantly produced, then that Ama also gets translated here. Because remember we had talked about the Jataragni being the controller or the master of all the other Agnis. It is the main digestive fire. It controls all of the other fires in the body. And so when that one becomes weak, it also starts to then suppress these Agnis as well. It lowers those Agnis, as well as the physical transformation of the Ama from the stomach to these dhatus then also starts to show the Ama changes in these dhatus. And this is where we actually get into the states of the beginning stages of pathology. So the one thing in Ayurveda, what we look at is the fact that even though we may not necessarily have the names for a lot of diseases or disorders, what we look at is the fact that almost all diseases or disorders can be somewhat traced back to this process. This is the reason why diet and nutrition is so essential and it's so important. Because diet and nutrition, from our perspective, is what is responsible for the formation of each and every layer and therefore carrying out each and every function in the body in a proper, healthy, normalized manner. So if the diet in itself is not healthy, if this process is disturbed, then it starts to disturb all of these other processes. And then, depending on how chronic it is and how much you're continuously going in the same manner of producing Ama, then having it move on to these dhatus, such as Rasa, plasma, Rakta, blood, Mamsa, the muscle tissue, Medas, fatty tissue, Asti, bony tissue, Majja, bone marrow and nervous tissue, and Shukra, which is the reproductive tissue. And then even translating all the way down to Ojas, which is the essence of this whole process. It is the final essence of the process of nutrition and digestion. And this Ojas is what is really responsible for a person's immunity. So if there is a disturbance, if there is a pathological state, it has started in this process. And that's why controlling or keeping a very normal, natural, healthy Agni is so essential to bringing a person back to a state of health. If they are in a state of disease, then this is one of also the key factors that helps them to come back to a state of health. Because at least what it can do, even if it doesn't address the actual problem, what it does is it prevents the problem from getting worse, right? Because if you can see, as we looked at, this is where the process starts to deviate and where it starts to become a problem. So if we can at least fix that, if we can at least increase the Agni and fix the diet that we're taking in, what that is going to do is that's going to stop the production of any further accumulation of Ama. And once you stop the production of Ama, then the body is slowly going to get a chance to then digest and get rid of the already existing Ama. And what it does is when it starts to do that, it's going to get rid of the Ama in the stomach. And also, it'll help to get rid of the Ama in the other parts of the body, depending on how chronic it has become. So the more the person continues to take in this particular type of diet, or like, for instance, the Thanksgiving type of meal, there are people who eat these type of meals every single day. And if they're having that type of food or that type of meal every single day, then can you imagine how quickly it's going to be for them to produce Ama and continuously produce Ama, more and more quantity of Ama. that ama trickles down very quickly to each and every one of these tissues and each and every one of these systems. Because this is not just representing just a tissue. It's also representing an actual physiological system that is, these are the substratum for where the doshas carry out their functions, right? So what happens is it starts to affect all layers and all levels of physiology and also anatomy. And by the time it progresses so far that it becomes apparent and it becomes shown as a disease, you can actually see, oh, well, you have this condition. By that point, it is actually in a chronic state because it has already gone through this whole long process and has built up enough to become seen. Usually before it becomes seen and before we know that you have a pathology or you have a disease or you have a problem, all of this has been happening internally. And the one thing about it is you can see these signs and symptoms are very vague. Like for instance, if someone has body ache or they have a low-grade headache, you think, oh, that's not a big deal. You know, it's a little bit of pain, but it'll go away after some time and you ignore it. But what those signs and symptoms are, it's your body telling you that something is not right. Something is not right. That's why it shows you. Your body tells you exactly what's happening. It's up to us to really take notice and listen to what our body's telling us. And what these signs and symptoms are is exactly that. It tells you that something's not right. Whatever you were putting in wasn't good. So now with all of these skills that you're going to be learning throughout these weeks, you're going to start to be able to notice and see the difference of what happens when you eat the non-healthy things and what your body's telling you. And when you do eat the healthy things that your body needs and that it wants, how you feel and what those effects are and how your body tells you that it's happy or how your body tells you that it's unhappy. So these reactions is basically telling you what's happening in this process, okay? So again, some of the signs and symptoms also that you will find when a person has ama, you're going to find that they have Shrotorodha. Shrotas is the channels, and we're going to be talking about this in the next weekend, where we look at exactly what Shrotas means. And Shrotas just basically means it's the pathways or the channels in where even these dhatus actually pass through and help to form the actual tissues and carry out the functions. The doshas carry out their functions through these channels and they're constantly circulating throughout these channels. So even in circulation, you need the channel or the pathway to be clear, right? It needs to be clear. So only if it's clear, if the pathway is clear, then it can carry out its function. If there is ama there, it actually starts to slowly block that ability for that flow to happen. And therefore, that is another way that it can progress and become a pathology because it's actually blocking the dosha's flow. It's blocking that normal function. So an example of this is somewhat like what you can physically understand, like sclerosis. Sclerosis of your arteries is a great example of what happens when a person has ama, and it's blocking the shrotas, it's blocking the pathway. That's what happens when you have ama. But it's not just only in arteries, it can happen in many other pathways as well. So Shrotarodha, depending on how chronic it has become, it can build up to the point where it's like plaque. And it starts to then reduce the actual lumen or reduce the area in which that channel has for the doshas or for whatever is flowing through it to carry out its functions. Okay? Another sign or symptom that you find when a person has ama is there's loss of strength. And you can see here why you would have loss of strength. Remember we talked about one of the major functions of Agni being that of enthusiasm and strength. So therefore, if you have ama, ama is a direct relation or a byproduct of what happens when the Agni is low. So all of the Agnis are in relation to each other. The most important one of them, or the most important function or intensity of its presentation, is that which is in the stomach. But there are other Agnis and there are other fires that are there all throughout the body. And we had talked about this in the weekend. Like there is fire present in your eyes that help to carry out the functions in actual vision. There's fire in the brain, such as like the sadhaka pitta, that really helps you to be able to perceive and is responsible for cognition. So in that aspect, if that Agni is low, all of these other functions of Agni as well, not just pitta, but in intensity or in general, the actual essence of fire and the fire element also helps for carrying out these functions and this expression of emotions, of enthusiasm, of cognition. So that's why, again, after the Thanksgiving meal, how do you feel? Do you really want to go and sit and read a very intense, difficult book to understand? Or would you rather sit in front of the TV and just veg out and kind of relax and not do anything? Because after a heavy meal, it is very hard to sit and listen to someone or to try and then perceive things that are very difficult to understand. Because you're not only feeling physically heavy at that point, but you start to even feel that heaviness in your mind, okay? That's kind of like that tamasika quality in the mind that also increases. So the person is not able to have that sort of level of cognition that they usually would have if their Agni was strong, okay? So that's why they feel lack of enthusiasm, they feel lack of strength, just because of the actual, it weighing them down and making them physically feel heavy. So that's, again, another one of the signs and symptoms. You feel heavy. And you usually tend to feel the heaviness directly in your stomach. Depending on how much of ama has been produced, you can actually feel your stomach. It's heavy and it's sort of weighed down. And you can feel the difference between the heaviness on the left side as opposed to the right side. So that in itself also indicates how much of actual physical ama is produced. It also tends to obstruct vata. Remember, I was just telling you about the flow between or throughout the shrotas or the channels. So what flows throughout channels? Whether it's a substance that's flowing, the actual movement in itself is carried out by vata. Vata can help to propel other substances, but it still can't move without the presence of vata. So even while it's moving, vata is there that's helping it move. It can't move without the presence of vata. Okay? So when there is ama, ama can actually prevent or obstruct the movement of vata. That's why, again, you can have this issue of constipation as well as diarrhea. Okay? The constipation usually happens when it is obstructing vata, and so therefore it's not allowing the apana vata to initiate the movement of the bowels in the appropriate manner. That's when you end up with constipation, also due to ama. You can also have diarrhea due to ama, and when that occurs, it's because the ama is so strong in the stomach that it is actually not allowing the food to be digested. So the body, what it does is it tries in every which way to just push that out and to get rid of it because it doesn't want to keep it in there. So what happens? It actually just expels it out. So you end up with both situations of it being either constipation or diarrhea. Both of these situations are actually due to ama. And though it seems really contradictory, it happens. It's even more technical in looking at how, when the Agni becomes low, how the body reacts in actually trying to push that ama out. Because ideally what your body does is your body will try every which way to bring it back to a state of health. Your body does not want to be unhealthy. Your body does not like being diseased or does not like being uncomfortable. So it will try to get rid of anything that is making it feel uncomfortable. And that's what it does. It can either cause diarrhea or it can cause constipation. The constipation usually happens actually after the diarrhea. If you notice, if you really pay attention to see how it happened, the diarrhea doesn't mean that it has to be like intense bouts of diarrhea. Even loose motions for someone who doesn't necessarily have loose motions can be considered as diarrhea due to ama. Okay, so even if they have ama for one day, and then after that they'll end up having the constipation too, because the ama is moved down and the ama is actually obstructing and blocking the vata from then further moving down. So then it results in constipation. Okay. So the person will also have signs and symptoms such as lassitude. They feel really tired and lazy and sort of disinterested. And again, that's the function of that enthusiasm and cognition that is typically due to Agni. It's suppressed because of the presence of ama. So that's why the person doesn't feel very enthusiastic. They don't feel very aware or very present. They're usually not very present in the sense that if you're talking to them, they're probably like, okay, did you say something? I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Or you find that you're reading one sentence like 10 times. That's, again, a typical sign of when somebody has ama, and they're just not able to concentrate, and then they're not able to be aware or present, okay? It can also cause excess salivation. And the reason why it can cause excess salivation is because it actually reacts here with, here, let me share this again with you. It reacts here with the Kledika kapha. It reacts here with the Kledika kapha, right here. So when ama is being formed, ama forms right here in this spot. And as the ama is going on building, the actual nature of ama is that it's slimy and sticky, okay? So when ama gets slimy and sticky, it has somewhat similar qualities to that of kapha. So it's very easy for the ama that's present here, to affect this Kledika kapha, because this Kledika kapha starts to move down and starts to appear at this part of the stomach. The ama being present here will start to build and build and build till it actually gets in contact more with the Kledika kapha and produces more amount of stickiness and sliminess, and therefore it can travel upwards. That's why you end up with that whitish discoloration or that coating on the tongue. You end up with that because of the presence of ama. It's ama starting to affect all of these factors that are responsible for digestion. So you end up with the coating on the tongue, and whenever there's anything present in the oral cavity, what does it do? It starts to salivate, right? Whether it's something good or something bad, but if there's anything at all present in your oral cavity, it causes salivation. And it's the same thing with the coating. When you end up with this coating, you find that you end up with excess salivation. And it's nothing but the ama affecting the kapha, okay? If you remember which kapha is there in the oral cavity, the bodhika kapha, okay? So it's this kapha that actually, that increases the excess salivation. Okay, other signs and symptoms of ama: obstruction of waste. So it, of course, it obstructs, because it obstructs the channels, it also obstructs the waste, because the waste products are excreted through different channels. So it obstructs the secretion or the waste products such as sweat, urine, and stools. So you can find that when these waste products do come out, they're actually mixed with ama. So there are even specific signs and symptoms of what you find with these different waste products mixed with ama. So an example of that, for instance, if someone has ama mixed in their sweat, the sweat tends to be of a very foul odor. and it tends to, you've ever noticed some people sweat and they have the staining in the armpits of their shirts? That staining and that very strong odor is nothing but the presence of AMA. So we found this a lot. In fact, with people who have a habit of consuming foods that are difficult to digest. For instance, people who eat red meat, who don't have that type of agni to digest red meat. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about red meat, but I think we all know what sort of qualities or effects it can produce in the body. And if you're eating red meat without the capacity or the ability to digest that red meat, what you find is one of the typical initial signs that the body's telling you that this is not good for you, you'll find that their sweat tends to be of a very strong odor. And even if they put on the best deodorant in the world and they mask it, what you will find is that there is a very strong staining in the armpit, in the axilla area, and in the axillary area of their t-shirts or their shirts. It's very hard for them to wear white shirts more than a few times, because what it does is it stains. And no matter how much of bleach or how much of detergent you put, it's very easy for that to come back again. So that is an indicator that whatever they're consuming or their habitual diet is not suitable for them. Their body cannot digest it. And this is the way the body is finding some way or the other to get this out or to excrete it out. Okay? So you're going to find that that happens with the sweat. Another thing is you find the same thing, like for instance, if there's AMA in the urine. AMA can be, when it's mixed in urine, you end up with all different sort of signs and symptoms of that, depending on the dosha predominance as well. So you'll have the dosha mixed with AMA, which is known as Sama dosha, which remember we talked about in class just briefly about the difference between Sama and Sama. So this is what we mean by Sama, Sa-ama, or with AMA. So that is the doshas with AMA. And when it's mixed with AMA, you tend to find these various signs and symptoms. So for instance, depending on the dosha mixed with that AMA and it being excreted in the urine, you're going to find the urine is much more turbid. It has a much more strong odor, and it's not of a normal odor. Urine usually doesn't have a very strong odor, the normal healthy urine. However, when it is in a pathological state, you can find that it has a very strong odor. And what you're also going to notice is that the urine with AMA, it tends to be turbid, and it also tends to be more concentrated. The color itself is quite darker than the normal healthy color of urine. And the reason why is because the AMA actually blocks the channels through which this urine is excreted. So typically, when a person, how they would excrete urine or how they would pass urine, instead of passing, say, 5 to 6 times a day, they would actually end up only going 2 to 3 times a day, because the AMA is not allowing them to feel the urge or to be able to excrete that urine in the same manner, in the same frequency that they did before. And so what happens? With the longer the urine stays in the bladder, it concentrates more. And you start to find that the color is much darker. So that's why you find, that's what is a typical sign and symptom when you find AMA that is being excreted out or mixed with the urine. Similarly, AMA in the stools or AMA in the bowels. You're going to find signs and symptoms of AMA in the bowels. It tends to be very sticky. It tends to be of a very foul odor, and it tends to be heavy. It sinks to the bottom of the commode. So again, when we ask these very silly, crazy questions, this is the reason why we ask that, is because we're trying to figure out how much of AMA the person has. And we want to know how chronic it is. So this is why we ask them about their stools. And we ask them, does it float or does it sink? This is the reason why. If it sinks, it has ama. Ama is there in the body. Ama is there in the digestive tract. If it's sticky, then again, ama is there in the digestive tract. And if it, of course, is a very foul odor and the person has all three of these signs in their bowel evacuations, again, it indicates how much or how chronic the ama is there. Okay, so now can you see why we ask these very silly, very personal questions? Because just by describing these signs and symptoms alone, we can figure out what's happening in the person's body. Okay, and now that you know this, you can start to see it in yourself. You can start to see when your body's telling you, it's giving you these subtle little hints that this is good for me and this is not good for me. I don't like this. Something isn't right. And it starts to reflect in these particular signs and symptoms. Okay? You're also going to find that the person has a lack of taste. And the reason why they have a lack of taste or a lack of an appetite is because of that coating on the tongue. The coating that tends to happen. So the more chronic the ama, the more chronic the production of ama, the thicker the coating, and then it starts usually at the root of the tongue and it starts to go more and more forward. So when in Ayurveda, when we do an analysis or we do an intake, the reason why we look at the tongue for tongue diagnosis, this is one of the major things we look at. We look at the coating on the tongue and the thickness of the coating and how far that coating has progressed. Is it only there towards the back of their tongue, or has it become so chronic that it's moving and it's spreading more and more and more towards the tip of the tongue? So this is another nice, cute little trick that you can figure out and you can see. Even, so you say, okay, well, if somebody has a coating on their tongue, then they can scrape it off. You know, if you have a good tongue scraper, you'll get rid of that. Or if you brush your tongue, you should be able to get rid of that. This is the thing. If somebody has ama and they use a tongue scraper or they brush their tongue, the coating still will not go away. We will still have, it can get rid of some of the bulk of the coating, but the coating will still be there. So you ever notice sometimes, like you brush your tongue or you scrape your tongue, but it still looks white and it still looks sticky, or it still looks like something in the back, and you keep scraping or you keep trying to get rid of it and it's not going away? The reason it's not going away is because you have ama. That's the reason why. Because that's not something that can be physically taken off. The fact that it's there and it's progressing from the inside, it's showing that the ama is there. So ama won't go. That coating on the tongue will not go by just scraping, by just removing the physical upper part of it. That ama only goes if you digest the ama. Okay? So again, what are some of the factors that are responsible for formation of ama? That was one of the things that we looked at. We looked at, the change in the process of digestion, okay? So again, in this process of digestion here, anything that affects these factors can cause ama. Also, that is looking at the physical part. So for instance, if you take large quantities of food, that can produce ama. If you consume food in an untimely manner, if you are eating food when the Agni is not present, or when it is very low, or it is not intense, then also it can produce ama. If you are consuming large amounts of cold water, remember we talked about the cold water? What that does is that, again, suppresses the Agni, so it's conducive for producing ama. Okay? If you are eating foods that are too dry, that are too cold, that are too absorbent of moisture, that are very irritating, or that are unclean. So unclean also includes those which are filled with pesticides or those which are processed that is also coming under the term of unclean. Of course, back in those days when they wrote this in Sanskrit, there was no processed or pesticide-filled food. However, now we can understand that that also comes under the realm of unclean food. Okay? So if you are consuming these type of food, and also if you are consuming food that is viruddha, or that is contradictory in nature, they do not mix well together. And I'm sure you guys have maybe talked about this, or Kate will be talking to you about viruddhahara and the incompatible foods. All of these factors can help in the production of ama. Any one of them. Untimely food, excessive quantity of food, drinking large amounts of liquid,